Okay, it's 10:25. Um, so what I want to do for a second here is I want to kind of get you to think with me a little bit about what's the best way or what are some effective ways of engaging people who are pretty resistant to help. I mean, who have everything is sort of the glass is half empty kind of thing, or they're highly resistant to, reaching out for help, even when it's right there in front of them, it's offered there. So maybe either in your own personal experience or life, or just your intuition or your thinking. How do you think? What are the best ways of dealing with that, of overcoming that kind of resistance? And this is the concrete challenge that caseworkers and therapists face all the time. Um, so, what do you think? Kathy says, I think start with empathy, compassion. I think that's a good, especially as contrasted with moral judgment. So, one of the things I try to communicate to caseworkers is that as you get to know the families and how troubled they are and what's happening to kids within those families, which really is bad. I mean, a lot of the time, it's very hard to overcome the tendency to start engaging in some very harsh, judgmental reactions to the parents. And those reactions are very understandable given what's going on, but they're just not helpful. They're just not helpful from the standpoint of doing something about the situation. So, being able to deal with people in a pretty objective, non judgmental kind of way. And that non judgmental does not mean accepting and tolerating some really awful bad behavior. That's not what it means. What else? What else do you think? Shelter hearing is sometimes a wake up call. Yeah, it sometimes is. And sometimes you can kind of get people moving at that point in time on some, so hopefully you don't have to wait till the dependency to get some services going. At least that would be the hope a lot of times. What else do you think? Some I ask caseworkers this question a lot of the time, and they have a whole variety of answers. So I guess the bottom line thing is that there isn't any one strategy or approach that works there. Sometimes you have to kind of feel around for whatever the needs of people are. So there are some people that you can actually sit down with and actually have a discussion about you can have a back and forth, a conversation. And if so, that is a tremendous strength. The parent already has a tremendous strength. They can engage in a conversation, interaction. They can a lot of times develop a relationship with you of various sorts. You already have a basis for building on that. Some parents are genuinely very concerned about the effects of their drug, alcohol issue or mental illness on their children. You can sometimes have a conversation, and when that's true, and when that's top of mind in a parent's thinking, that's a tremendous strength. I mean, you can build on that. You have a place to start. Sometimes that just isn't true initially because the parent is so consumed with their own issues that the needs of their kids can hardly enter their thinking initially a lot of the time. And some of the parents are pretty nonverbal to start off with, right? So um, so sometimes, particularly with the nonverbal type of people, you're kind of looking around. A lot of the time, the parents will have poverty related needs, right? And being able, attending to those needs initially, a lot of times it's just the place to start. In the absence of some other kind of hypothesis, the place to come back to a lot of the times is the concrete needs of people. I mean, and even as causes, you can recognize this a lot of the time. I mean, if someone's sitting there in the dark without electricity, you don't have to be a genius to figure out kind of what their immediate need is. So, um, So sometimes the poverty related services initially are the way to get something going there. A lot of the parents really do have physical health issues and dental need issues that have not been attended to for a long period of time. And so sometimes that's kind of a place to start. Sometimes it's in the kind of the marital trouble, the interpersonal kind of relationships. And so a lot of times the idea is to start connecting with people on the basis of how they view their needs. And so the kind of the number one kind of engagement rule in casework is kind of the social worker one rule, social work 101, is that you join to need. You join to need, and that need doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the same for all individuals there. Um, some people really do have a need to be listened to. Some people have a need. I've dealt with adults in this country, and not just, by the way, in child welfare, that no one has ever been curious about them for 1 second. No one has ever inquired in a curious, disinterested way and what they think about things, how they feel, what their needs are. No one has ever even done that basic humane thing. And some people, that's enough to begin to connect with them on that basis alone. You don't even have to take it to the point of empathy. You can just be curious about someone. I mean, really genuinely curious about how. And so always when you're talking about people who've come to very extreme points in their life, points that are hard to imagine how they ever got there. One of the things you want to try to learn a lot of times is about their histories. I mean, what happened? What brought them to that point? Because something did. They didn't just genetically have it that way. I mean, there was a long history in the way they kind of got there. So people who are really good at engagement are people who have this kind of emotional intelligence. It's not conceptual intelligence. It's not analytical understanding. It's kind of an emotional feel for what the person that you're interacting with needs and is interested in. And some people really have this intuitively, and some people have less of it than others. But even if you have less of it, and when I was a caseworker, I certainly didn't have more than my fair share. You can learn to do better over a period of time by just practicing this, right? So, for example, just to give you an example of what this might mean in a way that's maybe not completely intuitive. In motivational interviewing, any of those you who are familiar with that way of interacting with people with drug, alcohol, or mental health issues, right? One of the things that people in MI are trained to do is to just be curious about how drug users experience the benefits of drugs and alcohol. That is, before getting into a bunch of censorious comments about how much damage drugs and alcohol are doing, a lot of times to engage people, it's very helpful to just ask, well, what's the great thing about this? Because there must be something. I mean, if you're ruining your life with this drug, I mean, you're continuing to use it. And so a lot of times getting people just to say what their experience is in terms of the positive benefits. And then after that, then in MI, then once people have been, and you just let them talk about the benefits of using whatever they're using. And then at some point, the interviewer asks, well, is there a downside? You don't want to sit there and tell the person the downside of using drugs and alcohol. That must be already completely evident to them. You want them to say what the downside is. That's sort of the underlying idea of being curious. You want people to be curious. I mean, the first thing a therapist has to be is curious. So, and at some point, you want people then to spell it out for themselves. They're much more likely to act on that if they do. Now, sometimes it can be really simple things. It can be offers of just transportation to a treatment program. So I guess one of the things I'm trying to stress here is that if in child welfare, even at the level where you're at shelter care or at dependency or wherever you are in that process, kids are already in foster care. If you want people to fail in child welfare, hey, it's really easy. Just give them a really long order of mandated services. I mean, really long. And if you want them to fail, the longer the better. And then you give them a list of places where they can go get these kind of services that courts have, ordered them to receive. And you tell them, hey, you call these places, and a month or two or from now, I'll check in and see how you're doing. You want people to fail, that's how you do it. So if you want people to succeed, then they're going to have more emotional encouragement. They're going to have more recognition. There's going to have to be more contact. So the kind of the ways of approaching people that have worked in child welfare have to, particularly in terms of the family treatment drug courts or the safe baby courts, those kind of places, it's bringing people together in a team on a more regular kind of basis. And then again, being curious and inquiring about how a parent is done within the last week or two or whatever it is. And if they are doing their program, then they get lots of recognition and praise. If they're not doing their program, then people address that in a straightforward, candid, honest way at the time. So again, you want people to succeed, you have to recognize when they're doing little things of the type that you want them to do. Praise is very, very powerful, both with adults and with kids. And it's even powerful when you recognize that people are manipulating you. It's even powerful then, much less when it's genuine, right? So again, underlying social work 101 rule about engagement is you join to need. And so you have to figure out what that need is that's going to motivate a person to act here, right? So let me stop there. And by the way, there is I'm not going to talk about it because I don't have the time. There is an American movie on this subject that I do use in training that's really good called The Lookout. And you can find this movie. This movie still available. It's an American movie from about 2007, something like that. But it's about just real briefly, about a 18, 19-year-old young man in an upper Midwest town who has everything going for him, athletic star, just smart, beautiful girlfriend, alpha male in high school. And in his senior year in high school, he ends up in a car with his girlfriend and some friends on a back road at night, and he accelerates the car and runs into some farm equipment in the road. His girlfriend is killed. One of his friends in the back of the car is killed. And then it shows what happens to this kid in the next year as his life completely falls apart. And then this criminal gang comes to town and they want to engage him. He's working at a bank on a night shift. They want to engage him in a bank robbery. And so they have to engage with him. They have 20 minutes at a bar to connect with this young man. And so it shows what this criminal gang does in this 15 or 20 minutes to connect with this young man that they never met before. And they are savvy. They are smart about how to do it. And of course, they didn't learn that kind of engagement skill in an MSW classroom or a BSW classroom. They learned it in prison. They learned it on the street. They have street smarts there, right? But they use the basic rule. If you're going to connect with someone, you join to need. And they kind of understand with this young man that his need is to have his worth, his value affirmed. So that's what it is for him. I mean, for other people, it's something different. I worked, one time years ago in Tacoma. I live in Tacoma. I did training here. And this young caseworker in the office said that he had this young woman who, on his caseload, that was very down on herself because it seemed like every day was just a survival, challenge. And she totally was thinking about her own needs and how to get from day to day. And she never did anything that helped anyone else or anything. So he just took her at her word, and he set her up as a volunteer in a soup kitchen on a couple of days a week. And for that young woman, that had tremendous value because it really was a need of hers to feel useful to other people. For most other people on his caseload, it wouldn't have mattered at all. That wouldn't have been a need of theirs, but it was a need for that young woman. And so that's what I mean about you have to connect to need. And you have to get people, again, moving, doing things on their own behalf. You can help them to start doing those things, but ultimately they got to do things on their own behalf, right? So what's the name of the movie? The name of the movie is The Lookout. And it's an American movie, and you can find it. And It's good. And you don't want to learn a lot about engagement, you watch this 15, 20 minutes in this bar. You don't have to even watch the whole movie. You learn more in 15 or 20 minutes about engagement than you can learn from a 10-week MSW class. Because parental engagement is one of those things where you don't learn really about it by reading about it. I mean, it really is helpful to watch someone who's good at it do it. So it's kind of like the medical kind of idea about learning. You watch it, you do it, you teach it. You want to learn something hard, you watch it, you do it, you teach it. Watch someone who's really good at it do it. And then you do it in their presence, and it's not going to be easy for you like they make it look easy. And then at some point you teach it. Because when you teach something, you have to learn the underlying principles. So, okay, before I change the topic here again, let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions here. Okay, so over the years, I think I mentioned in a prior CASA training here that maybe most of the research studies, not more than about 50 to 60% of parents ordered into drug alcohol treatment are getting into those programs and completing them, that sort of maximum. Even when there's a court order, and even if the consequence of not following the court order is that they could have their parental rights terminated, they could totally lose contact with their kids forever. And so that 50 or 60% rate is actually quite an improvement over what that was in the mid 1990s. So there has been a lot of learning done there by child welfare systems about how to increase the rate of entry into and completion of drug treatment programs. And a lot of that learning has taken the form that I've already mentioned in bringing people together in teams and in the family treatment drug courts and in the safe baby courts. But sort of the lesson of those kind of practices for all child welfare is pretty straightforward. Every time that a child is in foster care for longer than a couple of months, there ought to be a team formed around the child and family. Every time, 100% of the time, not just when the family's in the safe baby court kind of thing, right? And why is that important? Because it brings people together at a time when feedback to people can be timely and meaningful. And when services can be delivered in a timely kind of way, and people can be given encouragement. And if they're screwing up, they can be called on it immediately in a timely way. So, and everyone who succeeds in these very difficult therapeutic kind of processes and recovery from any chronically relapsing condition is very, very difficult. There's going to have to be a lot of emotional encouragement there. It can't be just some information. Oh, here's where you go to get help. No. And also recovery is going to be a very difficult up and down kind of a process. There are going to be relapses. There's going to be, even in the absence of relapse, there are going to be times when the person seems to be totally just self-sabotaging, screwing up, deliberately undermining themselves. There are going to be those kind of things, right? So it is going to take some persistent kind of effort there. So just because someone fails a couple of times in treatment doesn't mean that ultimately that they're bound to fail. That's just the therapeutic course of things. Okay, before I change the subject here and talk about kids a little bit, let me stop and see if you have other kind of comments or questions here. Okay, so just one last comment, particularly for the drug alcohol related group. So remember, I've already talked before about what we want to see happen in treatment and so forth, right? But Catherine, would you say that active efforts are needed for every case? Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the actual legal difference is between active and reasonable. I mean, maybe there is some case law on the subject and everything, but from my point, active means agencies are reaching out to people. They're actually offering them encouragement and support. They're offering help to getting to services, finding services, dealing with problems in services. They're giving poverty-related services at the same time that they're supporting parents' involvement in drug, alcohol, or mental health, or so forth. They're doing those kind of things, right? And particularly for the cases where the kids are in foster care. I mean, if we want reunification to succeed, then that's what it's going to take there. So the idea there of recovery from drug and alcohol, particularly, is this one kind of guideline here. At the time that kids enter foster care, when their parents have actively involved in drug addiction or whatever you want to call it, substance misuse, or whatever kind of level of disorder kind of thing there is there, for many of those parents at that time when their kids are removed from their home, their need for those drugs is first and paramount in their thinking, in the way they use economic resources, in the way they devote, in the way they use their time, and in everything else in their life. The underlying kind of idea there in a recovery process is that you want a time when the kids come first. And even if parents are continuing to use drugs from time to time, even if they have frequent relapses, it's that motivational switch that we're looking for in the drug alcohol cases. It's that motivational switch from the drugs come first, the kids come first. And there's a number of ways of identifying that through behavior, particularly in the kind of social relationships that people have, and in the way they relate to the needs of their kids. That would be the other thing. Okay, so what I want to do here now is I want to talk a little bit about the effect of chronic neglect on kids, chronic neglect and chronic maltreatment on kids. So there is a huge science, and for those of you who are interested in a good summary of that science, there is a document online called The Science of Neglect that came out from a publication entity at Harvard. I can't remember right now the name of the entity exactly, but anyway, it's called The Science of Neglect. It's available online. You can read, it's a long document, but you can read a 10-page summary of the document if you're really interested in the science kind of thing here. Okay, so a video that I use in training sometimes is that maybe some of you have seen this. This is called a still face video. So the video shows a mom interacting with her 1-year-old child and the child is on a changing table. And the child is on his back, and the mother is sort of over the child, and she's smiling and she's waving her hands. The child is smiling, and the mother comes in and kisses the child and snuggles up. It's a very affectionate kind of reciprocal kind of exchange there. I mean, both are obviously enjoying it immensely. And then at a point, the researcher there says to the mom, "Show your son a blank face." And so the child, big smile. Child kind of tries to, hasn't really got good control of the hands yet. It's trying to raise the hands. And then the child notices that the mother isn't smiling back. The mother isn't giving any kind of response. And so the child looks a little disconcerted. Yeah, we can watch it. Yeah, you ought to watch this. This is only about a 6-minute thing. At some point, you ought really to watch this. So anyway, the child turns aside and he tries again. He turns back to the mom and big smile. And mom, completely blank face. Not hostile, just blank. Doesn't respond at all. So the child turns aside a second time, now looks very, very disconcerted, and he brings his hands together. And then the researcher says on the video that this child is using kind of a self-calming kind of thing. I mean, obviously the child is getting stressed. And so now the child does it a third time, turns back to the mom, big full smile. Mom shows the child a blank face. Child turns aside, now very, very distressed seemingly, and he begins to drool at the corners of his mouth. And then a few seconds later, he begins to hiccup. And the researcher says at that point is that this child now is beginning to physiologically dysregulate. And so he's physiologic, and this is all happening in 45 seconds. This is a happy child with a mom, very, very connected to the mom, good attachment there. And in 45 seconds, this mom, through the unresponsive blank face thing, has started to dysregulate the child. So yeah, this is a still face video kind of thing, right? So it turns out that physiological, and by the way, more profound example or more serious example of physiological dysregulation would be a disruption in a feeding cycle or in a child's sleep. Physiological dysregulation then lays the foundation for emotional dysregulation. I want to say that again. Physiological dysregulation lays the sort of developmental foundation for emotional dysregulation. And kids who are either severely neglected or traumatized are going to have emotional dysregulation problems. They are going to be highly stress reactive, and they are going to have a lot of trouble in calming down. Okay. This video then follows with a sort of a brief description of some research done by a psychiatrist named Rene Spitz in the 1940s in this country. This guy was Austrian. At one point, maybe even kind of famous in child psychology, not anymore, but then. And Spitz did research in what were called foundling homes, Foundling. So one time, I guess in a CASA conference years ago in Olympia, I was before a big group of you guys, some of you maybe, and I guess I kept saying foundling homes. People thought I was saying Fondling instead of the other, and started to laugh and whatever. So now I always spell this out. But anyway, yeah, foundling home anyway, were homes where kids are raised, and very young children, babies, toddlers, were being cared for in facilities by nursing staff, and with very good physical care and with the care of medical experts on a daily basis. And so Spitz did a lot of research in those foundling homes. And one of the studies, he did a study, for example, in Denver, where he looked at 90 kids who were being cared for in one of these foundling homes by nursing staff for the most part, compared to 60 kids who were being cared for in another home in the same community with nursing staff, but with one major difference. The mothers of the kids were living in that facility, which was a detention facility, and they were allowed to mother the children a few hours a day. So you had kind of a natural experiment. Kids who were receiving very good physical care, but no mothering at all, versus kids who were receiving good physical care and some mothering. What was the difference in outcomes? 36 out of the 90 kids died within a 2-year period of time. 0 out of the kids with mothers died within a 2-year period of time. 36 to 0 in terms of child deaths. So this video then goes on to say, well, Spitz's research had a lot of influence on social research. It had a lot of influence on social policy. We don't have those kind of places anymore, for the most part, in the United States. And those places existed in the United States and Europe for over a 60-year period of time. It took 60 years to figure this out. So it turns out that one of the major effects of severe neglect in early childhood, and the most severe neglect, by the way, is being raised in some kind of institutional setting without mother. That's the most severe neglect, right? It compromises kids' immune systems. So I'm going to say this again. One of the first effects, before you get into anything else about the effects of chronic neglect on kids, is that it compromises kids' immune systems. So the kids that we deal with in child welfare, that is going to be a very sickly group of kids. And I mean sickly, I mean very poor health. There's going to be a lot of chronic illness there. There's going to be a high rate of disabilities. The kids are going to be a very, very needy, unhealthy group of kids. So that's part of what it means. Now, partly that's possibly due to the exposure to drugs and alcohol in utero. Maybe that's partly that. And it's also a product of the way that a lot of times the kids are being parented there, right? So trying to think what else I'm going to say about the foundling homes here, if anything else, right? I guess the other thing I want to say is those kids who died in those homes, they didn't die of mysterious illnesses that no one that is, it wasn't like a medical mystery. And they died of normal childhood illnesses, which they were more susceptible to and which they recovered from more infrequently. So that's the sort of the compromise the immune system kind of theme. And that's the first effect of chronic neglect and chronic maltreatment on kids. It's that. So one of the things last year in the sort of the sounding board series, I wrote a whole series of sounding boards on all cause mortality in child welfare, and both in kids in foster care and outside of foster care, meaning kids who don't just die of child maltreatment, they die of diseases at higher rates. And so it turns out now that there is a literature, and it's a large one. So we really are talking here about life and death issues here for lots of kids. Okay, so what does it mean? I want to go back to this sort of emotionally reactive theme for just a second here. So about maybe 15 years ago, a book came out called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. Some of you may have read that book. At the time, it was pretty well known, pretty almost famous, really. And so this book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, authored, one of the authors is Bruce Perry, the main author is a child psychiatrist, and at the time ran a child trauma center in Texas. And a journalist author named Maya Solovitz, who still writes for the New York Times and other places. But anyway, this book has 6 or 7 chapters about kids that Perry had encountered over the years in his practice. And one of these chapters is about the boy, the title, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And so Perry tells this story about the time he was a psychiatric resident in a Bay Area hospital emergency room. And he was called in for a consult by docs and nurses about this little boy who was 6 years old at the time, who was in the middle of the emergency room, and he was in a cage. And this little boy was naked within this cage, and he was down on his hands and knees, and he was covered in food and feces, and he was uttering sort of unintelligible sounds. I mean, he didn't have speech or language. He was throwing the food and feces at the docs and nurses, and they weren't really amused by that. They really didn't like this little boy. And so what Perry said was that seemingly what they wanted him to say was that this kid had genetic brain damage and that probably needed to be in an institution, no way. And yet Perry did, before he was willing to say that, he did, even as a resident, he understood one thing these docs and nurses did not understand. And he did one thing that they didn't do. And so what do you think the one thing was in this emergency room? What do you think the one thing was that Perry did that these other docs and nurses had not done? Got to eye level. He eventually did do that, but that's not what he did initially. Engage with the boy. He does do that initially. These are good answers, but that's not what he does initially. Hug the boy. No, he couldn't have done that initially for reasons I'm going to explain in a minute. That would come much, much later. The one thing he does that no one else had done in that emergency room is he took a careful social history. I'll say this again. Anytime you want to understand really extreme, bizarre behavior from anyone at any age in any situation, you want to start off with getting a history. How did the person get to be like that? And so what he discovered was that this young boy had been born to a drug addict mother who abandoned him when he was 2 months old, that he had lived with a nurturing grandmother till he was about 1 year old. At the time the grandmother died, and he ended up in the custody of a friend of the grandmother's who was a dog kennel operator. And this guy was, for the most part, gone during most of the day, and he left this this boy throughout the next 5 years, for the most part, in a cage in this dog kennel thing, and he primarily had interactions with other dogs, I mean, and he had a funny way of sniffing that was really quite disturbing to the nurses and the docs. They really didn't kind of like it and all kind of thing there. So once Perry understands that history, he understands right off the bat that this kid probably isn't genetically brain damaged. The kid has not been socialized. The kid has not been cared for in the way that a normal little boy would be cared for. And why did he understand that? Because the kid had not been nurtured at all. It's possible that he did have genetic brain damage, but the more plausible explanation was he just hadn't had any parenting. So at 6 years old, he's a feral little kid. So at that point, then Perry gets down on his hands and knees and he gets away from the cage. So why does he get away from the cage, right? He gets away from the cage because this boy is terrified. Why is he throwing food and feces at the docs and nurses? Because he's scared to death of them. He's using food and feces as weapons. That's why Perry couldn't open the cage immediately and have contact with this boy, because he would scare the kid to death if he did that. He gets down on his hands and knees. He tears up a bit of a muffin and he models eating the muffin with pleasure. Why does Perry do that? Because he understands that this little boy is hungry. This little boy has been throwing all of his food at the docs and nurses. He understands the boy's hungry. He models eating this muffin with pleasure. And then once he has the boy's attention, he does it again. And then once he knows he has the boy's attention, he throws a little bit of the muffin in the cage. And this boy eats a little bit of the muffin and likes it. At that point, Perry knows he has him. Perry knows he has now connected with that boy through the medium of food. So at that point, he is down on his hands and knees. He moves closer to the cage, closer to the boy, where he can actually get close. So the boy is not afraid of him now because he associates him with something good, that is with food, right? So after some contact like that, he has the nursing staff come in there and take that little boy out of that cage and move him into another room that has less stimulation, less foot traffic, fewer docs and nurses passing through there. And so the kid is kind of now in a quieter kind of place. And so Perry says that within a couple of days, they actually are able to get this boy cleaned up. They're not able to do it initially. Within a few days, he's actually standing on his feet. You know, the boy literally couldn't stand upright at age 6. They got the kid cleaned up. He starts to utter sounds. Some of those sounds sound a little bit like words. Within a few weeks, he's starting to say words that fit into sentences even, right? So then Perry says that within 3 to 4 months, this kid is actually able to go into foster care. He said this kid had made more rapid progress from a quasi semi-feral state than any other kid he ever interacted with over a long period of time. Why do you think this little boy was able to do that? What was it about this little boy's history that allowed him to go from a feral state to the state of a boy who could be placed in foster care? Yeah, the grandma's attachment. He had a nurturing relationship with a caregiver in the first year of life. He had the best developmental asset a baby can have in the first year of life. He had early nurturing there, which meant he could form relationships with people. Now, sometimes people have asked me, well, what if he didn't have that? What if he had been from Romania? What if he had been raised in an institutional setting and he had never had any kind of a relationship with a caregiver at all? Would they have been then able to help this boy? And the answer is yes, but it would have been much, much more difficult because he wouldn't have had the basic developmental foundation for being able to form a relationship there. So there's no point at which a kid cannot be helped. There is no point at which it's hopeless, but it's just going to be a lot harder. And so finally, this kid ends up going into foster care, and then this kid writes in the chapter, this kid writes Perry a postcard, and he says, Dr. Perry, you saved me. And then Perry says, I cried, right? So, Perry is a big ego guy. He's a hero of these chapters and these stories and everything. But at the same time, he knows a lot about severely neglected and traumatized kids, right? And so the first thing that, of course, the lesson here is that to help kids who have these very extreme early histories, the kid has got to feel safe. That's also true, by the way, of traumatized adults. You're not going to help a traumatized person until they feel safe, physically and emotionally safe. And so to do that, he needed to be in the quieter room. And Perry calls that, less stimulation. Then Of course, he sets up this, what I call structure. Perry calls it pattern repetition, which just means there's a very predictable routine. So a lot of times what turns out that the safety of foster kids, their feeling of psychological safety, I mean, and the psychological safety of lots of traumatized people depends on knowing what's going to happen next, on having a very predictable kind of routine in their life, right? And foster parents, even who are not trained in trauma, will learn this very, very quickly. That in order to manage a traumatized or severely neglected child well, they're going to have a very strict, predictable kind of routine. And so little by little, of course, a kid has to be weaned away from that, right? You can't go through life knowing everything that's going to happen to you next. There has to be ability to tolerate some uncertainty there. But initially, with severely neglected, traumatized kids, it's going to be very, very limited initially. So gradually, little by little, their boundaries for being able to tolerate uncertainty are going to have to be stretched there. And that's sort of the therapeutic art. That is what it means to be a therapeutic foster parent or a therapeutic caregiver. So other ways of making, so the best resource that I found on this particular subject of how to help kids to feel safe is a book called Nurturing Adoptions, and it's by a therapist who lives in Bellevue in this state, whose name is Deborah Gray. And this book is one of several books she's written. She's written another book on adoption called Attachment and Adoption. She's written a few other books, but this is the one I like the best because it's the most practical and concrete around the skills that caregivers and professionals can use to help kids to calm down. And it's very developmentally oriented. Like, so what you do for kids who are pre-verbal is, with kids who are verbal, you can use a whole range of other things. But to give an example, probably the most widely used emotion regulation skill at all ages is breathing. So it's slow breathing. And so as not Perry, but Gray describes it, it's 6 breaths a minute. It's breathing in through the nose, breathing out through the mouth. Slow breathing is calming. And so it turns out that even when I was at Casey Family Programs a few years ago, we heard a Head Start expert from Alaska talk about the use of breathing exercises at nap time in their Head Start classrooms with 3 and 4-year-old kids, right? You can use breathing exercises. If any of you have ever been to a stress reduction workshop in any of the organizations you ever worked in or any place else, someone has probably talked to you about breathing because it's a basic self-regulation skill. So to help kids in foster care who have these kind of extreme early histories, and this means we're here, remember, a lot of times we're talking about chronic maltreatment histories, not just neglected plus abused and or sexually abused and emotionally abused and neglected as well. They are going to have emotional reactivity problems. They are going to have difficulty in calming down. And for that reason, they are going to be very, very challenging to foster parents and to adoptive parents as well. And when foster parents and adoptive parents do not understand how to deal with these meltdowns that kids have and that they're liable to, then those kids can be abused or neglected in foster care or in adoptive homes as well. And there have been some horrible cases of child deaths in this state in adoptive homes, somewhere between 12 and 20 over the last 15 years. And that's in adoptive homes. And there have been some cases like this in foster homes as well. So a lot of times this grows out of the inability to calm kids who are in the meltdown thing. So, some of you probably, so Janet says sensory integration therapy helps a child have a calm body. Yeah, so a lot of this information has been summarized in a book, bestseller book, The Body Keeps the Score, the Bessel van der Kolk book, which was on the bestseller list for years, and maybe still is. I recommend that book. The Boy Who Raises a Dog has a lot of this information. And the Deborah Gray books do as well. And then another book that I like a lot is called Trauma Treatment for Children and Adolescents. And it's by, I can't think of the name of the lead author now. I'll think of it here in a minute, right? But it also has very good information to how kids help with the calming kind of thing. So breathing, a basic way of helping people to calm down. And by the way, these are people of all ages, not just people who have emotional problems. This is all of us. So a lot of what mindfulness stuff is, a lot of the stuff that has to do with trauma treatment in this country came out of Buddhism. And it came out of the Buddhist study of the mind, right? And so a lot of that information has been sort of taken out of that religious context or any of that sort of Buddhist practice manuals, and it's being used in treatment programs. And a lot of it has to do with being able to observe oneself and being able to recognize when you're upset. The problem that lots of little kids have, of course, is they don't even recognize when they're upset. You can't ask them, why are you upset? They don't least understanding of that. So, okay. So another, for example, basic thing would be touch. So one of the things that Gray reminds people is that lots of kids can be calmed through touch, but there's a whole bunch of traumatized kids for whom touch is toxic. So one of the things that anyone who deals with young kids needs to learn pretty quickly is whether kids can tolerate touch, whether that is really calming to them, or whether touch is perceived by them as threatening because of their early histories, right? So as a kind of example there, lots of adults in this country, no matter what religious ideas they have, use meditation as self-calming kind of thing, right? So, and if you start with any course of meditation, and you read any book on the subject, they're going to tell you initially to start off with breathing and start off with conscious breathing. And so years ago, I read an introductory thing on how to meditate or so forth. And the author gives the advice, start off with 3 conscious breaths a day. And I read this a couple of times. I can't believe when I'm reading, because I think I could do 3 conscious breaths in 10 seconds, maybe, or something. And then, of course, I try to do it. And it just in practice turns out to be difficult, because breathing is one of these automatic things our body does for us, our body and brain does for us. Very difficult to be mindful about that. You have to practice that. But when you do practice it, you find that it is a way to calm down. And that's so, back to the old maxim that when you're angry, count to 10 before you react, right? So a lot of times when I do training with child welfare staff, and I do a lot of focus on the effects of neglect, and there are many effects of neglect on kids functioning, but I tend to focus on this emotional reactivity, emotional regulation kind of thing there, because if kids don't have that capacity, they cannot make it in this society. They cannot negotiate the school system. They are not going to make it through the school system if they are liable to meltdowns and they're not able to calm down. And by the way, the inability to calm down, that is a disability. That is an extreme disability in life. And so it will hamper children in everything they do. I watch, as perhaps some of you do, I watch a lot of pro sports, and I watch a lot of great athletes who have this issue, that is, and their competitors are very aware that they have the issue. So, why is trash talking so common in basketball and football and in sports there? Because people have found out that you can just completely undermine the functioning of some people by just little insults. Some people are extremely reactive to that. And when they are reactive, that makes you very, very vulnerable. That is a weakness. Other people can, imagine a little 8 or 9-year-old kid who, if someone looks at him wrong, is going to go off and have a meltdown. Principal has to call his mother and take him home from school stuff. So over the years, I've had people in training where sometimes people who have worked in residential care facilities or at Echo Glen and juvenile detention, or maybe even sometimes in adult prisons or a mental health institution. And I ask people if they've ever participated in a restraint, and if they have, then they remember it. So a kid who's in a meltdown, how long does it take a kid 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, to calm down once they go into a meltdown? So I've asked this question a lot over the years, and sometimes I've heard as low as 30 minutes, and I've heard several hours. There are some kids who do not calm down until they have completely exhausted their physical energy and they fall asleep. And when they fall asleep, it's like their brain has hit the reset button and they wake up and they're regulated. So, and it can be everything in between that. And the meltdowns are very, very extreme when they happen. If you've ever participated in one, I mean, the kids bite and they scratch and they claw and they hit and they spit, and if they have words, they call you vile names. And lots of adults don't have a clue about how to deal with that. So the first thing that trauma-informed care would mean in this state, it would mean this right here. Concretely, it would mean that caregivers, I mean, that's all foster parents, and it would be all kinship care providers, and people hopefully in schools would learn how to deal with kids who are in the meltdown phase of things. So of course, ultimately what you want kids to be able to do is to recognize their triggers. You want them to be able to not only to deal with the meltdowns when they start, but to stop the meltdowns before they begin. They can only do that if they're mindful of triggers. And that's just something that it takes a lot of work on that. It takes a lot of code. That is another thing, what it means to be a therapeutic foster parent, is that a person has the ability to help a child over time to recognize their triggers, the thing that set them off. And to say this again, for the most part, kids of any age don't have a clue about what it is that's setting them off. They have to learn that. So there is a resource online called Developmental Repair. And this is a resource that was developed in Hennepin County several years ago by a woman named Ann Garrity, who's a psychologist at the University of Minnesota. So this is also something I've written about, but it's also available online. You can look for Developmental Repair online. So that is Developmental Repair is a day treatment program for kids in the 3 to 9-year-old age range. And for traumatized kids, maybe half these kids in developmental repair might have child welfare involvement at any one point in time, and some of them don't. And so developmental repair uses a couple of tactics there, strategies, so to speak. And one of those strategies is an acronym that they call HIRE, H-I-R-E. And HIRE refers to the process once kids enter a program, then initially, for whatever reason, they tend to gravitate to 1 or 2 staff within the program based on who knows what. But as soon as a kid has done that, then the program says that that kid has hired that staff person to be the person that helps that kid to regulate. They're the co-regulator. So when kids are about to melt down or in the middle of the meltdown, then the person who has been hired by the kid stays an arm length from that kid at all times. So the idea for kids who have meltdowns, who have these kind of trauma histories, it's not time out, it's time in. It's not, say that again, it's not time out, it's time in. And these are very frightening type of experiences. And so little by little, then the person who has been hired then wants to help the child develop a narrative around why they have the meltdowns. And so they do that through careful observation of the kid on a day in, day out kind of a basis. And it might be something like you were playing with Judy and she took your toy and you didn't like that. And you screamed and I came over and I gave the toy to Judy and you were very upset with me. And the next thing I know, you're fighting with Bob. So little by little, they help the kid to develop sort of a narrative around what it is that sets them off, that helps them gradually to become mindful and to be able to recognize their own triggers and to be able to control their own behavior in that fashion. So that's the sort of the underlying idea of sort of trauma-informed care there. So let me stop before I do that and see if you have, and I really appreciate those of you who have put these links up here on the subject. These are good resources. Some of these now developmental repair, I've written something about that, so I can send you something on that too. Take 3 conscious breaths. That's interesting. I never have seen this particular link there. That's interesting. I do recommend Deborah Gray book, and in my view, every licensed foster parent in this state and the unlicensed kinship care providers as well ought to receive a copy of this book, because it's less than $20. It's very helpful. It's concrete. It's skill based. It's anyway, I recommend it highly. So let me, and by the way, just one other thing I do want to say on the Deborah Gray subject. I've become kind of friends over the years with Deborah Gray because I've recommended her book so much. And so I asked her one time years ago, well, why did you name your book Nurturing Adoptions? And she says, well, I didn't name my book. She says, authors don't generally name books. It's publishers who name books. And they named the book Nurturing Adoptions because they said adoptive parents might buy this book, whereas they didn't think foster parents would, and they didn't think birth parents would. But the book is just as good for foster parents and birth parents as it is for adoptive parents. It has much the same kind of value. So anyway, let me stop and see again before we change the subject here, whether you have a comment or question here. Oh, I was going to say that Deborah Gray is in this state and she is accessible, and I have used her occasionally as a consultant on cases. And so, I don't know, some of you who have really difficult kids that you're serving as a CASA for, and where particularly the child welfare system is just throwing up its hands and just doesn't have any idea about what to do about or with that kid, you might think about, initiating a contact with Deborah Gray, who is really one of the world's leading experts on this particular subject. Let me stop here. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences studies, which I think many of you are probably pretty familiar with. And I've been amazed at how well the scholars have done in disseminating this research over the last 20 years or so. So maybe of all the research in child welfare about the effects of child maltreatment on kids, maybe this research has had the most attention. And of course, part of the reason is because it's pretty elegant in a way. And so the adverse childhood experiences research began in Kaiser Permanente, this HMO in San Diego, and then in the mid 1990s, and it involved a study of 15 to 20,000 upper middle class adults, mostly white, who were receiving medical services from Kaiser Permanente, and these people voluntarily agreed to be a part of a research study on adverse childhood experiences. And so they then were given a survey about their childhoods to fill out. And the survey asked them about 7 or 8 different adversities. And so one of the adversities was growing up in a home where a caregiver abused you more than one time, and where you actually received injuries. You were injured as a result, not just that you were hit, you were also injured. And there was a pattern of such injuries. It asked about growing up in a home with sexual abuse. It asked about growing in the initial survey, asked about growing in a home with emotional abuse. It asked about growing up in a home with at least one substance abusing parent. It asked about growing up in a home with DV. I mentioned before initially the DV witnessing kind of stuff. It asked about growing up in a home with a chronically mentally ill parent. And it asked about being separated from a parent at an early age for at least one parent for whatever reason. And that could be death, disease, it could be poverty, it could be foster care, it could be divorce, it could be any of those things. So the idea then was to give yourself, this is a score you give yourself, and the score, so let's say that there are 8 of these things. Now, some of the more recent surveys in this have added neglect. Some of them have even added poverty recently. So some of these lists have kind of expanded, but the initial one was 7 or 8. And so you have a score. And so the score might go from 0 to say 8. And if you had a score of 0, it meant that, you didn't remember having any of these bad things happen to you. And amazing as it sounds, in the San Diego sample, about 50% of these upper upper middle class white people, mostly, said that they gave themselves a score of 0. Well, I never met anybody like that, but they must exist in large numbers because of the San Diego thing, right? But so it just turned out that even a difference in a score of 1 or 2, even the difference between a score of 2 or 3, or a score between 3 and 4, turned out to have a very long-term effect on health and mental health into one's 50s and 60s. And so people with higher ACE scores, and so the acronym here is ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences, the people with higher ACE scores then are more likely to have obesity, diabetes, heart disease, more likely to have several types, not all types, but several types of cancer, more likely to have gastrointestinal illnesses of various types, more likely to have drug and alcohol issues, more likely to have depression, more likely to have tried to kill themselves, more likely to have sexually transmitted diseases, a whole range of health and mental health issues into one's 50s and 60s. Based in there, again, the elegance of the thing is that it's dose related. That even if a difference in a score of 1 or 2 would make a difference in the sort of, and remember, we're talking about frequency, we're talking about, the odds, the risk of, it's not. And so I had been in these presentations, and there had been a number of them in the state over the years, in which at the end of the presentation, someone in the audience will always raise their hand and say, well, what about the protective factors? I mean, what about those things that keep those bad things from destroying our health or causing us to die early? And by the way, in the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, it's not just a risk of having these diseases, it's a higher risk of having early death. There's a mortality risk here. And this is why I say we're talking about life and death issues here. There was one study that came out in JAMA within the last year that actually linked high adverse childhood experiences scores to 400,000 deaths a year in the US. Now we're talking about much higher rates of early mortality into middle age and into old age, into one's 50s and 60s. And it turns out that scores of, if you have a survey with, for example, with 8 items, if you have a score of 4 or more, then your risk is particularly high. And kids in foster care, invariably, they have scores of in the 4 to 8 range. And some of them have all of the factors. And they almost always, because very few kids in foster care have just been maltreated in one way. That is just a complete fiction thing. And in addition to the underlying problems that parents have whose kids are in foster care, drug and alcohol issues, mental health issues, domestic violence, and so on. Right? And not to mention the poverty thing. And I didn't even, to say this again, the early ACE surveys thing didn't even list poverty as a risk factor, even though it is a major league one. So over the years, I've heard people ask the presenters this question about protective factors. They don't have a research-based answer to that in presentations. At that point, some people in the audience just get mad. I've even seen some people occasionally just get up and leave, but for the most part, they just can't believe they don't have a research-based answer to this. But of course, there is a lot of research on the subject about resiliency. It just isn't from the ACEs studies. But there are dozens, literally dozens of other studies, many of them not necessarily child welfare studies. Some of them are child welfare studies, right? But these studies have kind of a consistent group of messages there. And the messages there are pretty darn simple. And most of you have probably heard them over the years. And the summary of them that I like the best is in the Judith Herman book, Trauma and Recovery, which came out in 1992. That is still, by the way, probably the best book, at least the book that I think is the best on trauma. It's not the book with the most up-to-date information on trauma. That's the Bessel van der Kolk book, probably. But in terms of eloquence and insight, it's hard to imagine anything that is more insightful and eloquent than the Herman book. But anyway, she has a chapter in there on her clinical work with Vietnam veterans. And she wrote that book for the most part in the 1980s. And at that point, she was working with a lot of people who had been in Vietnam. a lot of soldiers. And so she found that these soldiers would come to her, ex-veterans, they would come to her with symptoms of PTSD. And she discovered pretty quickly that many of these soldiers would get over these symptoms really pretty quickly. And one of the, by the way, the lessons from evidence-based studies in recent years is that PTSD is very treatable. I mean, the effect sizes in studies of evidence-based practices with PTSD, they're really high. I mean, the success rates are really, really high. So a lot of the soldiers would just get over the symptoms, but there were a group of soldiers who, veterans who wouldn't get over the symptoms. And some who was very difficult, and others who just never got over it. And so Herman then wanted to understand, well, what was the difference between these groups that had quick early recovery and those who didn't? And she said there were these main differences. The soldiers that were most resilient, and resiliency means, by the way, the ability to recover. It doesn't mean that you're invulnerable. It doesn't mean that you don't get sick. It doesn't mean that you don't get mental health problems or other things. It means you get over it. You're more likely to get over it. Okay, what did she find? First, that under conditions of danger, they were able to affiliate. I want to say that again. Under conditions of danger in combat, they were able to affiliate. They were not lone rangers. Resilient people are not lone rangers. So, which means is they can join with other people. They have the ability to form those kind of helpful, reciprocal type of relationships. And that is a condition of survival in dangerous circumstances. So that ability to affiliate, right? The second one is that they were able to emotionally regulate their behavior and their emotions. And so this is sort of going back to the discussion that we just had. That is, in combat, they did not go berserk. They did not torture enemy prisoners. They didn't kill unarmed civilians. They didn't do those kind of things, right? They were able to maintain some kind of moral foundation in war, which Herman says rightly, that's very, very difficult. It's easy to say when you're not in combat. It's another thing when you're up against people who really are trying to kill you. And so, and thirdly, they had proactive coping style. So again, this sounds very familiar from the early discussion. That is, in the face of challenges, they were not passive. They didn't always do the right things. They didn't always do smart things, prudent things, but they didn't give up. They didn't throw in the towel. They didn't find 100 reasons why they shouldn't go to treatment or why they shouldn't accept help. They were proactive. And so those were the three main things that Herman found, and those were the main things that most of the other studies have found on resilience. Now, the one other thing that I added in past years based on my observation of foster kids when I worked in child welfare was that particularly people who have interpersonal issues and difficulties, they are going to need to have a take it to the bank talent. And so, and by a take it to the bank talent, I mean a talent that is skill that is socially recognized and praised and rewarded in the society in which they live. So for example, if they're not good at school, maybe they're good at athletics. And if they're not good at athletics, they're good at music. They're talented in some kind of way. They're good with animals. They are good with gardening. They're good cooks. They have something going for them that the society values, that the community values, and that they are able to develop those skills over time. And because they have those kind of skills, they receive a fair amount of praise and recognition, and other people put up with them because they are going to be a lot of times very difficult people to put up with if they've had early histories of trauma and or of severe neglect, right? So the worst thing that can happen to kids in foster care, for example, is not to have those type of pro-social skills and to be failing at school. And then sometime in early to mid-adolescence, some kid discovers that they have a very good, highly valued antisocial skill, which is that they're good at violence. Other people are afraid of them. If anyone messes with them, they're going to kick their butt in a major league way. I mean, they might acquire weapons during the time they're adolescents or so forth. That's the worst most harmful developmental trajectory there could be for a child. They don't have a pro-social skill, but they have a highly valued, at least in their little neighborhood or community, a antisocial skill. That is, they're potentially violent. Other people are afraid of them, and for really good reasons. So, and for that group of kids is headed to prison or to institution or to early death. So that's how serious these issues are about. So that is a sort of hopefully a lesson for all of us who deal with foster kids, is that they are not only going to need mental health treatment of various types, they are going to need skills. And a lot of the foster kids are not going to be good at school. They're going to have a lot of trouble in school, both with the academics and with the behavior expectations and so forth, right? So they are going to need some skills. So one of the things we ought to be doing with school-age kids, all of them, we ought to be engaged in a persistent talent search. We ought to be looking for things that foster kids are interested in. And then once we find even a little flicker of interest in something, we need to be jumping on that, recognizing it, encouraging it, funding it, helping the kid in various kinds of ways. So in the same way that middle class and upper middle class parents, and a lot of times I found lower middle class parents do this with their kids on a routine basis. So you think about what middle class parenting is in this country today. It's driving kids around to soccer games or to gym classes, or to, I live a block from UPS. In the summer, they have cheerleading camps over there. They have math camps, they have debate camps. They bring hundreds of Mormons together. They do, kids are being given all kinds of opportunities there to develop both talents and social relationships there. That's what it means to have privilege in this country. That's what it means to have advantages, which, middle class people don't even call those advantages. That's just the way life is. But it's the way life ought to be for the foster kids as well. And it can be. There's nothing prohibitively expensive about any of this. It just is being conscientious enough to do it, and to having enough of an interest in the kid to do it. And then, of course, there's going to have to be patience with the kids as well, because many of them are going to be very, very difficult. And of course, if the kids do not get control, some emotional control on their behavior, by the time they're 6, 8, 9, 10, they are going to grow up in residential care, or they are going to be in institutions, or they're going to be on the street. That's what's going to happen to them. So that's why the stakes here are really, really great. And so the thing that's different from the time I was in child welfare, and we had many of the same issues with multiple placements and with moving kids all over the place, all those things that you're familiar with. We had all those issues in child welfare at that point in time. But the thing that we didn't have that now is available to all of you and to people in the child welfare system, there wasn't all this understanding of trauma that there is now. There weren't all these resources. There wasn't the boy who was raised as a dog. There wasn't the trauma stress informed network. There are all kinds of resources online now. You don't even have to necessarily read books. You used to have to read books. You don't have to do that anymore. Because the resources are out there, and they're foster care, actually, there is the potential to actually transform foster care into a therapeutic service for behaviorally troubled kids. And so some of you have heard my spiel on this. The main negative downside on foster care is not what people who are outside, hate the whole foster care system say it is. It's not the trauma of removal. It's not, serious as that is, that's not it. It's the inability a lot of times to help the behaviorally troubled kids. And those are the kids who are having difficulty in foster care. And a lot of those kids, people can't help them because they can't deal with their emotional reactivity issues. They don't know how to do it. But the knowledge for how to do it and the skills for how to do it are now out there. They're everywhere. And so there just is no excuse anymore for this inability, this fecklessness around the inability to deal with behaviorally troubled kids, because the knowledge has increased so much in 20 years. It's just phenomenal how much it increased. But knowledge is one thing, implementing knowledge is another thing. And it just takes time and effort. Turns out that's a very hard thing to actually do. So some of you have heard my spiel of if this foster care system that we have and other states have is going to be better, there is going to have to be a professional cadre of foster parents There's no way that voluntary foster parents are ever going to do this adequately. I mean, they do need some basic knowledge and skills around trauma-informed care in the type that I've already mentioned there. But in order to handle the really difficult kids, we're going to have about 10 to 20% of the foster parents who are professional foster parents. And that means they are salaried. They have benefits. They don't have to work at other jobs. This is what they do for a living, and they are professional. There is going to have to be some educational qualifications. There are going to have to be some training requirements. There are going to have to be a whole bunch of services and supports that are built around them. And that can be within the context of private child placing agencies, but it can also be outside of private child placing agencies, right? So it turns out that child welfare systems and policymakers have been very loath to consider this idea. But they don't have better ideas. It's not like they're offering better ideas. They're offering no ideas, basically, for this behaviorally troubled group of kids. Now, the way to understand a lot of times kids in foster care, roughly speaking, this is a simplification, but it's a helpful one. About half the kids in foster care have serious behavioral issues, and about half the kids in foster care don't. So I think foster care, while imperfect, works reasonably well most of the time in most states for the kids who don't have serious behavior problems. And a lot of those are very young kids. It doesn't work very well at all for the kids who do have serious behavior problems, and that's about half the kids. And a lot of those are the school-age kids. So I think of foster care as kind of like a bifurcated system. There's the foster care system for little kids, and then there's a foster care system for big kids. And that's I agree, again, oversimplification, but at the same time, it sort of gets at the heart of the issue there, which is that currently, as things are now, foster care is not a therapeutic entity in the aggregate for behaviorally troubled kids. On the other hand, it saves the lives of many very little kids. And there is plenty of evidence now that that's so, based on the all-cause mortality studies that I mentioned before. So Nancy, rather than professional foster care, why not pay parents to care for their own children? Also a good idea. So again, remember these experiments in economic interventions around the country. Now, there are some cities now that are paying low-income parents as much as $500 a month in family support programs. I've already mentioned little amounts of money can stop a lot of foster placements, and they can stop a lot of CPS reports. Once parents are chronically neglecting, however, money in and of itself is not going to do it. I already mentioned that before, right? So the poverty-related interventions, the standalone poverty-related interventions, they're going to be effective. They have to be provided to people in a timely way before the neglect that they're engaged in is chronic or is combined with physical abuse and neglect, right? Now, for the kids who need professional foster parents, why not pay parents to care for their own children? Because by and large, it isn't going to work for those kids. Now, that doesn't mean that we should write the parents off or they shouldn't have any contact with the kids or anything like that. It's just that by and large, they don't have the skills. So about maybe I would say 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, a lot of people in child welfare believed that the solution to all of our foster care problems was kinship care. We didn't have to put kids in with stranger foster homes. We just put them with relatives. This state is now putting about half the kids in foster care with relatives. That's a good thing. But it's not a solution to all the problems of foster care because the kinship care providers have no more ability to deal with the behaviorally troubled kids than the stranger foster parents do. So in and of itself, now there's some times and there are some families and where you can use a wraparound kind of a model to support parents, kids in their parents' home and we used to do this, and sometimes the cost would be as much as, even 20 years ago, it'd be as much as $5,000 to $10,000 a month. It would be as much as residential care at the top rates, right? I found that we were able to do that really a lot of the time, really very, very frequently, we were really able to do that. So sometimes with that proviso, you can use wraparound kind of stuff. It's not just giving people money though. I mean, it is doing that, but it's giving them an awful lot of other supports as well, right? But there's lots of drug addicted and mentally ill parents and violent parents who just, even with those wraparound services, just cannot do it. That's just the fact. And so we are going to need a foster care system for those kids. And we want it to be a therapeutic foster care system, not the one we have today. For those kids. Okay. So let me, we're at 11:44, 11:45. Let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions about any, and some of the materials that I've mentioned, I will not probably today, but on Monday, I will send Ryan some of the materials that I've talked. I'll send you this thing on developmental repair. And then you've already got all these links here, which are very, very good. So, and then if other things, if any of you are interested in any other kind of resources that I mentioned, and you get in touch with me or through Ryan, be very, very glad to send you whatever I have here. So let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions. Janet, the wraparound models of, you know. Okay. It used to be in past years, Janet may probably know more about this than I do. In past years, wraparound was mostly provided through the state's public mental health system. And so there has been a lot of kind of erratic efforts over the years with wraparound in this state and lots of other states. It just turns out that wraparound doesn't turn out to be a lot of times a really specific type of evidence-based practice. So in other words, a lot of differences in the wraparound programs. I found out, however, that if they were done well in past years, that there were a lot of families that really could parent their kids, even their behaviorally troubled kids, with a whole bunch of supports around them. So it's something that we ought to be using to the maximum extent that we possibly can, rather than putting kids in residential care programs, which are by and large not working. So other kind of comments or questions there? Okay, one last thing I want to say, and then a couple minutes, we'll stop this. To have a better response to chronic neglect and chronic maltreatment in this state, we are going to have a different administrative kind of structure for delivering services here. I do want to say this here, right? So currently, I think the CPS systems, child welfare systems, are doing a really very, very inadequate, and that is to be kind, a very inadequate job of intervening with these families. And remember, these are the troubled families that have combinations of neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect as well. Part of the reason is that these cases, a lot of times with families that have 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40 reports, are being assigned to an overwhelmed, overworked CPS caseworker who doesn't know much about chronic neglect at all. And even if they did, they just aren't able on their own. They're not resourced to be able to deal with families that have these kind of challenges. It's too much. So if we're going to deal administratively, we have to be organized in a way where we have interagency collaborations here that deal with these most troubled families. And this is arguably about 20 to 25% of all the screened in reports. So it's not 1 to 2%. It's in the 20 to 25% range of all the screened in reports. We need a different administrative structure. And so we need a case management structure where we have people from substance abuse, from mental health, from public health, sometimes from DV, and we need parent advocates. So we need teams of 4 to 5 case managers who work together, sit together in an office on a regular basis, and they share 20 to 25 families and all the kids in those families, which would normally be about 40 kids. And that would mean working with kids who are in their own home. And by the way, just to tell you how it actually is, most chronically neglected, chronically maltreated kids are growing up in families. Some are being placed in foster care, some are not. Mostly they're not, for reasons that I don't have time to discuss here, really. But for the most part, the kids are growing up in the homes, right? But some of them are also in foster care. We need these interagency teams that are going to work together on a regular basis for mutual support, because these are very, very difficult, challenging families to deal with on a regular basis, right? And in the absence of those kind of supports, what happens is that caseworkers become pretty demoralized. They become about as hopeless as helpless as the parents are. And so when I worked in child welfare, I encountered a lot of hopeless, helpless people who really felt very ineffective, and for good reason, because they were not effective with this particular group of families, right? So you need people to come together for mutual support, and you need that kind of expertise. This is not an area where we can help people with good intentions alone. I mean, we can't help people without good intentions, but we have to have skills there. We have to have knowledge, and particularly from the substance abuse, from the mental health, and from the DV areas. And for the very little kids, it would be tremendously helpful for kids in the 0 to 2 range. Every time that there's a CPS case, we have a public health nurse assigned every single time. I mean, that would be a tremendous step forward here in terms of the quality of practice. So we have been able, child welfare systems partly haven't done these kind of things, partly because of funding issues in past years. That's been part of it. But more than anything else, they haven't done it because they haven't been motivated to do it, truthfully. And they haven't been motivated to do it because they're not getting enough community pressure to change their practice with these families. They're continuing to do things that don't work, and they just do them over and over again, but they don't work. But they don't change it when they don't work. So the first thing that has to happen is there has to be this administrative reorganization if things are going to be more effective here. And then there are now, compared to in past years, there are funding streams both from the Family First legislation, but also in Title 19, the Medicaid funds, and Title 4B. Money would be an issue here in the kind of thing that I'm proposing here, but it also is very, very possible to do a lot of it within current funding streams, if there is the motivation to do it. And I found in past years as child welfare administrator, I didn't have to pay people from substance abuse or mental health to come in and join in teaming on child welfare families. They were perfectly willing to do that for free, as long as that gave them some role and voice in decision. So you just don't have to pay a fortune to get this kind of expertise going there, right? But there has to be the will to do it there, right? And in child welfare to date, there has not been the will. Okay, maybe with that, I'll stop. You've got my, Ryan has got my email address. I'd be very glad to respond to requests for resources. I'll send you the stuff that I mentioned before. I wish all of you the best. You know, it's hard to express, I think, how important you are in lots of these families. I hope you know that, but if you don't, I'm telling you.